Before we dive into this incredible journey of survival, make sure to subscribe to Wildlife Legends and share this video with friends. Your support helps us bring these emotional stories to life. And feel free to share your thoughts on how we can create even more impactful content for you. The icy winds howled across the vast, frozen wasteland of the Arctic. The endless snow and ice stretched far beyond the horizon, a barren, desolate world where life was a daily struggle for survival. In this unforgiving landscape, a young polar bear cub lay alone, her tiny body weak from hunger and exhaustion, her once bright eyes dimming in the harsh, freezing cold. The cub's mother, a powerful and protective figure in the wild, had gone. She was gone like so many others in the rapidly shrinking world of the polar bears. The cub had been left behind, lost in the vast, icy expanse, a tiny soul at the mercy of nature's wrath. The Arctic was no longer the sanctuary it once was. Melting ice, disappearing habitats, and the brutal consequences of climate change had claimed so many lives, including her mother's. It was a tragic reality, and the cub's chances of survival seemed slim. She was barely able to move, each breath shallow, each step more uncertain than the last. The overwhelming silence of the snow, the only sound being the wind and the occasional crack of shifting ice, seemed to echo her isolation. She had been abandoned in the wilderness, and the cold was relentless. But fate had other plans. As the cub struggled to keep her eyes open, a figure emerged on the horizon, a man, trudging through the snow, his face determined but filled with concern. He had seen the tracks, the faint marks in the snow that led him here. His heart pounded in his chest as he neared the small, vulnerable creature. His name was Ben, and he had spent years working in the Arctic region, studying its wildlife and its increasingly fragile ecosystem. As a researcher and conservationist, he had witnessed the devastating impact of climate change firsthand. The polar bear population was dwindling, and the Arctic was warming at an alarming rate. This was no longer just about the animals, it was about the planet itself. Ben was here to study, to understand, and most importantly, to help. He knelt down beside the cub, his breath visible in the freezing air, and his heart sank as he saw the dire condition she was in. Her fur, once thick and pristine, was matted with ice, and her small body trembled as she struggled to lift her head. It was clear that she was fighting for her life, but she was too weak to survive much longer on her own. Without food, shelter, and warmth, there was no chance she would make it. Ben's first instinct was to call for help, but he knew there wasn't enough time. The cub's life was hanging by a thread. He looked around, hoping for some sign of her mother, but the Arctic was silent, empty. The cold was overwhelming, and Ben's breath caught in his throat as he realized the magnitude of the situation. This little cub had no one, and it was up to him to save her. His training kicked in as he carefully scooped the cub into his arms, cradling her fragile body against his chest. He wrapped his jacket around her as best as he could, trying to keep her warm. The cub let out a weak whimper, her eyes flickering open for a brief moment, before closing again. Ben's heart broke as he realized how fragile her life truly was. He couldn't waste any more time. He began walking back toward his camp, each step a battle against the biting cold. The wind stung his face, and the snow seemed to fall harder, as if the world itself was conspiring to stop him. But Ben pressed on, his determination unwavering. The cub's life depended on it. As he walked, Ben couldn't help but think of the bigger picture, the climate crisis that was driving these animals to the brink of extinction. He had seen it before, the melting ice, the shrinking glaciers, and the changing migration patterns. It was happening faster than anyone had anticipated. The Arctic was dying, and the polar bears were paying the ultimate price. Ben had dedicated his life to studying this region, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of this little cub, abandoned and alone in the freezing cold. He knew the risks of rescuing her. Polar bears, even young ones, were dangerous, and there was always the possibility that her mother would return. But Ben couldn't bear the thought of leaving her to die out here. She deserved a chance, even if the odds were against her. As he neared his camp, Ben's mind raced with possibilities. What could he do to save the cub? Could he nurse her back to health? Could he keep her safe until help arrived? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let her die alone in the cold. Ben carefully laid the cub down on a soft patch of snow near his tent, setting up a small fire to keep them both warm. He worked quickly, knowing that time was running out. The cub's breathing was shallow, her eyes still closed, but she was alive. That was all that mattered for now. The fire crackled as Ben prepared a makeshift shelter, his hands trembling from the cold but determined to keep the cub safe. The Arctic was unforgiving, but he wasn't ready to give up on this little life just yet. There was still hope, and as long as there was hope, he would fight for her. The night in the Arctic was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you question your own heartbeat. Ben sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the cub, her small body curled up against the warmth. He could feel her heartbeat, faint but steady, beneath his hand. He could hear the howls of the wind outside, but the fire offered a fragile barrier between him and the merciless cold that lay just beyond the edge of the camp. For hours, he stayed by her side, not daring to leave, as the flames flickered and danced. He knew the cub needed warmth, but more importantly, she needed food. He had no idea how long she had been without it, and he wasn't sure how much longer she could last. The signs of malnutrition were all too clear: her fur was thin, her bones visible under the fragile skin, and her eyes, once bright and full of curiosity, were now dull, hollow. Ben's mind raced. He had never faced a situation like this before. He'd studied polar bears, yes, observed them from a distance, and read the research, but this was different. This wasn't a textbook scenario. This wasn't an animal that could be rescued with a plan or a well-meaning intervention. This was a life hanging by a thread, and Ben was the only one who could try to save her. He thought back to his own time working with the bears. He had been there during the summers, watching them from a distance as they hunted, fished, and survived. But he had never seen such a vulnerable one, such a helpless soul. It was one thing to study an animal in its prime, to observe the graceful power of a full-grown bear. It was something else entirely to hold this cub in his arms and know that if he didn't act fast, she would not see another day. But what could he do? The closest research center was miles away, and even then, they didn't have the resources for such an emergency. His only hope was to keep her alive until he could get help. But there were so many dangers in the Arctic, so many obstacles that could take her life before he even had a chance. A chill ran down Ben's spine as he thought about the bear's dwindling population, the effect of the climate crisis on these majestic creatures. He had witnessed the ice disappearing in front of his eyes. He had seen whole ice floes break apart, leaving polar bears stranded and helpless. He had watched mothers struggle to find food for their young, only to lose them in the brutal battle for survival. But this was different. The desperation in the cub's eyes, the fragile trust she seemed to place in him, made his heart ache. Ben couldn't shake the image of her mother. Where was she? He had seen the signs of a polar bear family's tracks leading to this spot, but there had been no sign of the mother. Had she abandoned her cub, or had something happened to her? The thought made Ben shudder. In the Arctic, survival was a cruel game, one where a mother's instinct to protect her cub was often tested to the limit. But in a world where the ice was melting and food was scarce, the rules of survival were constantly changing. As the night wore on, Ben managed to get some rest, though it was fitful. He kept one eye on the fire and the other on the cub. He knew that even the smallest drop in temperature could prove fatal for her. He could hear the wind grow louder, the storm picking up strength outside. The thought of another blizzard hitting them, trapping them in this remote area, made his stomach tighten with fear. He wasn't sure how much longer the shelter would hold up, or if they could survive a full storm without supplies. Just as Ben was about to drift off to sleep, the cub stirred. Her tiny body quivered beneath the blanket of warmth he had created, and she let out a soft whimper. Ben's heart skipped a beat as he quickly leaned over her, his fingers brushing her fur. "Hey, little one," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." But the cub's condition was deteriorating faster than he had hoped. Her breathing grew even more shallow, and her once glossy fur seemed to be losing its luster. Ben knew that time was running out. The longer she went without food, the weaker she would become. He had to act fast. He needed to find a way to nourish her, to restore her strength, or all of this would have been for nothing. The wind howled louder, as if in protest, and Ben looked out into the darkness, where the swirling snow obscured everything in sight. It felt like the Arctic was closing in on them, the storm pressing them further into isolation. But even in the midst of this desolate, freezing world, Ben felt a glimmer of hope. There was still time. As long as the cub was still breathing, there was still hope. Suddenly, a noise cut through the stillness of the night. Ben froze, his senses sharp. It wasn't the wind or the storm. It was a low, distant growl, coming from the direction of the trees. A growl that sent a chill down his spine. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He knew exactly what it meant. Could it be? Could the cub's mother have returned? Ben's heart raced as the distant growl pierced the stillness of the night. His first thought was that it could be a wolf, but the sound was different, deeper, more powerful. It was unmistakably a polar bear, one that was far too close for comfort. Ben's pulse quickened, his fingers tightening around the small cub he was trying so desperately to save. The growl came again, this time closer, its deep resonance vibrating through the frozen ground beneath them. The hairs on the back of Ben's neck stood on end. His first instinct was to protect the cub. After all, polar bears were known to be fiercely protective of their young. But was it the cub's mother? Could it be possible that she had survived, that she had found them in this vast, frozen wilderness? Ben's breath caught in his throat as he listened, his senses heightened. There was no mistaking it now. The growl was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy paws crunching through the snow. He needed to make a decision, and fast. The camp, though well set up to shield them from the cold, was no match for a full-grown polar bear. If this was the cub's mother, Ben would have to face the possibility that she could be dangerous, not out of malice, but out of instinct, wanting to protect her baby. He couldn't let his fear cloud his judgment. His main priority was the cub. He had to make sure she was safe, no matter what. But Ben also couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching possibility that the growl wasn't just a sign of the mother returning, it could mean something else entirely. Ben slowly lowered the cub into a small, makeshift bed by the fire, covering her with extra layers of clothing to keep her warm. His mind raced as he scanned the area. There was no way he could outrun a polar bear, especially in the storm. But he had one advantage: the bear wouldn't see him until it was too close. The blizzard that raged outside had cloaked the camp in snow, creating an impenetrable veil. He grabbed a flare gun from his emergency kit, his fingers numb as he loaded it. The flare wouldn't scare off the bear, but it would give him a chance to signal for help if it came to that. The growling grew louder, closer, and Ben's muscles tensed. He dared not make a sound, not even a breath. The last thing he wanted was to provoke a bear in a panic. The moment he had feared for so long was here, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, the camp erupted into chaos. The tent flaps were ripped open by the wind, and in a flash, the massive form of a polar bear loomed in the doorway. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as the bear stepped forward, its eyes glinting with suspicion and hunger. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of charging or attacking, the bear froze, its eyes locking onto Ben. The moment felt like it stretched on forever, the wind howling around them, the cub still nestled safely by the fire. The bear's breath came in heavy, quick bursts, its nostrils flaring as it surveyed the camp. And then, after a long, tense silence, it took a tentative step forward. Ben stood perfectly still, holding his breath. He wasn't sure what was happening, but something in the bear's eyes made him pause. It was as though the animal was confused, unsure of what to do. This wasn't the aggressive, territorial behavior he had expected. This wasn't an attack. The cub let out a soft whimper in the background, and the bear's head whipped around in that direction. For a split second, Ben thought the bear might lunge at the cub, but it didn't. Instead, the bear took another step toward the fire, its movements slow and deliberate. What was happening? Ben's mind raced. Could it be possible that this was the cub's mother? But she was too calm, too measured in her movements. She didn't seem desperate to reclaim her baby. And then, in that fleeting moment of calm, it hit Ben, the realization that nearly stopped his heart. This wasn't the mother. This wasn't the bear that had given birth to the cub. It was an older female, possibly a relative. She had the same protective instincts, the same drive to care for the young. But something had happened to her own cubs, something that had left her alone and wandering. This was a bear in search of family. She wasn't here to claim her young, she was here for connection. Ben's breath caught in his throat as the bear, in a show of surprising tenderness, stepped closer to the cub. Her eyes softened, and she nudged the small, fragile form with her nose. It was an unexpected act of kindness in this harsh, unforgiving land, and it left Ben momentarily stunned. He had seen this before in other animals, an instinct to nurture, even when the circumstances were beyond their control. The cub, still weak, stirred at the bear's touch, her tiny eyes opening to meet the older bear's gaze. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. It was a tender moment, a moment of trust between two animals who had nothing but the instinct to survive. But then, just as quickly, the bear pulled away, as if realizing that the cub wasn't hers to claim. She gave one last, lingering look at Ben and the cub before turning back into the blizzard, disappearing into the night. Ben stood in stunned silence, his mind reeling. What had just happened? As the storm continued to howl outside, Ben remained frozen in place, still processing what had just transpired. The bear, an older female, he now realized, had shown an unexpected tenderness, but what did it mean? It didn't make sense. Was it the loss of her own cubs that had caused her to act so? Had she been searching for something to care for? But Ben couldn't afford to linger on these thoughts for long. His priority now was the cub, he had to keep her alive. The bear was gone, but the storm was still raging, the fierce winds making the temperature drop even lower. There was no way to know what the future would hold for the cub, but one thing was certain, Ben had to find a way to nourish her, and fast. He rushed to his supplies, grabbing what little food he had left. The freeze-dried meals in his pack wouldn't help the cub, she needed warmth and nourishment in the form of real food, food that would give her energy and help her regain strength. But what could he do? He had no way of knowing where he could find food for her in this frozen landscape, no way to get it to her without risking his life in the process. Ben knelt beside the cub, his breath shallow as he studied her. Her eyes were still clouded, her tiny form so fragile, and yet there was a glimmer of hope in the way her chest rose and fell. She was still alive, still fighting. With trembling hands, he carefully wrapped her in more layers of clothing and covered her with a blanket. His fingers were numb, his body exhausted from hours of trying to keep her warm, but he couldn't stop now. Time was running out. He stepped outside into the bitter cold, the wind biting at his face as he squinted through the storm. He had no idea how long he had been out here or how much longer he could survive in these extreme conditions, but he knew that he couldn't afford to waste any more time. He had to find food. The blizzard made it nearly impossible to see anything, but Ben pushed forward, each step taking him deeper into the wilderness. The ground beneath his boots was slippery and treacherous, the ice cracking under his weight. The freezing wind was relentless, driving snow into his face, making it difficult to breathe. Yet, he knew that he couldn't stop. Hours passed, the storm showing no signs of letting up, and Ben's hopes were fading. But just when he was about to give up, he caught a glimpse of something in the distance. Through the swirling snow, there was a patch of ground, clear of ice and snow, where the earth seemed to be moving. It was the faintest of signs, but it was enough to give Ben the courage to keep going. His heart raced as he sprinted toward the spot, the wind howling in his ears, the cold gnawing at his skin. He had no idea what he was running toward, but something told him he had to reach it, whatever it was. When he finally arrived, he dropped to his knees in the snow, panting from exhaustion. There, buried beneath the snow, was a patch of open ground, and in the middle of it, a cluster of seal carcasses, torn, raw, and half buried in the snow. The storm had uncovered them, the harsh winds stripping away the layers of snow that had concealed them. Ben's heart leapt in his chest. This was it, this was the food he needed to save the cub. With trembling hands, he started to carve pieces from the carcasses, his breath coming in sharp gasps as the freezing air bit at his skin. He wrapped the meat in his clothing, covering it as best as he could, before turning back toward the camp. The walk back was grueling. The storm hadn't let up, and each step felt like an eternity. But Ben didn't stop. His mind was fixed on the cub, the tiny creature that had already endured so much, and he wasn't about to let her down. By the time he reached the camp, the storm had grown even fiercer. The wind was howling with a ferocity that rattled the walls of the shelter, but Ben didn't hesitate. He rushed inside, the meat in his hands, and knelt beside the cub. Her tiny body was still, her breathing shallow, but there was a flicker of life left. He quickly prepared the meat, carefully cutting it into smaller pieces that he could feed her, warming it over the fire. His heart pounded in his chest as he gently tried to feed the cub. She was weak, but her mouth opened at the scent of the food, and for the first time, Ben saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She took small bites, each one a battle, but she was fighting to stay alive. As she ate, Ben sat beside her, watching her with bated breath. The fire crackled softly in the background, the warmth offering a brief respite from the cold, but the real warmth came from the bond that was beginning to form between them. He wasn't just saving a life, he was building a connection with this creature, one that transcended species, one that defied the cold, the storm, and the odds. Ben's eyes filled with tears as he watched the cub eat. He had no idea what the future would hold, but at this moment, the only thing that mattered was that she was alive, and he was there to help her fight. But the storm raged on, and the challenges were far from over. There were more dangers in this harsh landscape, and even with the food and warmth, survival was still uncertain. Ben stayed beside the cub for what felt like hours, each passing minute stretching into eternity. Her tiny body had slowly regained some strength, but the storm was far from over. The winds continued to howl outside, shaking the shelter, and the temperature was dropping even further. Ben's own body was exhausted, worn thin by the cold and the constant vigilance he had maintained to keep the cub alive. But he couldn't afford to let his guard down now. Every so often, he would glance at the fire, checking to make sure it still burned brightly. The warmth was the only thing between them and the freezing cold outside. Without it, they would both be doomed. He couldn't help but think about how fragile life was in the Arctic, how one moment of neglect or weakness could spell the end. But as he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the cub let out a faint, almost inaudible whimper. Ben immediately snapped to attention, his heart racing. He looked down at her, his eyes searching her fragile form. She was still weak, but there was something different in her eyes, a glimmer of awareness, a spark of life. She was fighting. "Hey, little one," Ben whispered softly, brushing the snow from her fur. "I know you're scared. But I'm here, and I won't let anything happen to you." The cub's small, trembling body shifted slightly as she let out another whimper. Ben could tell that she was still struggling to stay conscious, her body too frail to handle the harsh conditions. Her survival instinct was strong, but her strength was limited, and the storm wasn't showing any signs of letting up. Ben looked around the shelter, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here forever. The storm would only continue to get worse, and the food he had gathered wouldn't last long. He needed to move, to get the cub to a place of safety. But where could he go? The vast wilderness outside was an endless, frozen expanse. The nearest research station was miles away, and even if he could make it there, he wasn't sure they would have enough supplies to survive the journey. The storm's fury continued to grow as Ben weighed his options. He had to act quickly, but there was no easy choice. The Arctic had always been a land of extremes, but this was something else entirely. Suddenly, the cub let out a sharp, panicked cry. Ben's heart skipped a beat, and he rushed to her side. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she was thrashing weakly, her small body trembling uncontrollably. "Shoo, it's okay," Ben said softly, trying to soothe her. He reached out to gently cradle her, but as his hand touched her, he realized what was happening. The storm was growing stronger, and the cold was beginning to seep into the shelter, making everything feel even more inhospitable. Ben's eyes widened as he realized that they couldn't stay in the shelter much longer. The wind was howling louder than ever, and the walls of the shelter were beginning to creak under the pressure. The storm was closing in, and if they didn't leave soon, they would be trapped. With a deep breath, Ben made a decision. They had to move. It was the only chance they had. He grabbed the cub gently and bundled her up as best as he could, making sure she was warm and protected. He had no idea where they would go or how long they could survive in the storm, but he knew that staying here would only lead to their end. With the cub in his arms, Ben crawled out of the shelter and into the blinding snow. The wind hit him like a wall, pushing him back with every step he took. The cold was unbearable, but Ben pushed through it. His legs felt like lead, his body numb, but he couldn't stop. The cub's soft whimpers were the only thing that kept him moving. She was relying on him, on his strength, his determination, and his will to survive. Ben gritted his teeth as he moved forward, each step an effort against the relentless force of nature. The storm was growing stronger, and he couldn't see anything through the snow. It was a whiteout, a complete loss of visibility. He had no idea which direction he was heading in, but he knew he couldn't stop. He stumbled forward, dragging his exhausted body through the thick snow. The wind howled louder, and the snow seemed to fall faster, blanketing the world in a thick, unyielding layer of white. The cold bit into his skin, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he fought to stay conscious. For what felt like an eternity, he moved through the storm, the weight of the cub in his arms growing heavier with every step. The snow was deep, and the wind pushed against him with all its force, making it nearly impossible to move forward. His body screamed in pain, his muscles burning from the exertion. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the cub down. Finally, after what felt like hours, Ben saw something through the swirling snow, a dark shape, a faint outline against the white backdrop of the storm. His heart skipped a beat as he realized what it was. It was a cave, a small, sheltered hollow in the side of a mountain. Ben pushed himself toward the cave, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold. He stumbled inside, collapsing onto the ground, the cub still clutched in his arms. The cave was a temporary refuge, but it was the only chance they had. Ben quickly huddled against the wall, sheltering the cub from the storm outside. The cold was still unbearable, but at least they were out of the wind. Ben's body shook uncontrollably as he clung to the cub, his mind spinning. This wasn't the end. They had made it this far, and they weren't giving up now. The storm outside raged relentlessly, but inside the cave, Ben and the cub were shielded from the worst of it. Ben's body shook with exhaustion, but his determination burned brighter than ever. The cub, though small and fragile, was alive, and that was all that mattered. He held her close, trying to provide as much warmth as possible, though he knew he couldn't do it for much longer. Time was running out, and he was running on fumes. His eyes drooped, his energy completely spent, but he couldn't let himself fall asleep, not yet. Not until the cub was safe. For hours, they huddled in the small cave, the howling wind outside serving as a constant reminder of how dire the situation was. Ben had no idea how long they would have to stay there or if help would ever come. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, and it felt as though they were the last two living beings left in the world. But then, something incredible happened. The cub, who had been so weak and helpless before, suddenly stirred in Ben's arms. Her small body quivered, and for a moment, Ben thought she was only reacting to the cold. But then she raised her head, her eyes locking onto his. There was something in her gaze, something unmistakable. It was the first time in what felt like days that he saw her looking at him with something other than fear or confusion. It was a look of understanding, a bond that transcended the distance between species. Ben's heart swelled as he gently stroked her fur. "You're stronger than I thought," he whispered softly. "We're going to make it through this, I promise." The cub let out a faint whimper, but it wasn't the sound of distress. It was almost as if she was trying to comfort him, telling him that she wasn't going to give up. Ben's eyes filled with tears. She had been through so much already, lost her family, faced death head-on, and yet she was still fighting, still holding on. Her will to survive mirrored his own. Hours passed in silence, the only sounds being the howling wind and the soft crackling of the small fire Ben had managed to start. The fire was flickering low, but it was enough to keep them alive, for now. Ben didn't know how long they could survive like this, but he knew they had to keep moving. They couldn't stay in the cave forever. The storm would eventually pass, and when it did, they would need to be ready to leave, to find food and safety. As dawn approached, the storm began to subside. The wind still whipped through the air, but it was less intense now, and the snow was starting to slow. Ben stood up, his legs stiff and aching, but he had no time to waste. He carefully placed the cub on the ground, wrapping her in the thick layers of clothing he had with him. "Stay close, little one," he said softly. "We're going to get through this." With the cub in his arms once more, Ben stepped out of the cave, the biting cold still nipping at his face. The world outside was a bleak, frozen landscape, the remnants of the storm scattered across the snow in the form of drifts and ice. But the skies were clearing, and the sun, though faint, was beginning to shine through the clouds. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Ben a glimmer of hope. He walked carefully, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew he couldn't waste any time. The cub's survival depended on him finding shelter and food. They were still in the middle of nowhere, and help seemed like a distant dream. But Ben had already defied the odds once, and he wasn't about to stop now. As he walked, Ben thought about everything they had been through, the brutal storm, the desperate struggle to survive, the bond that had formed between him and the cub. It had all seemed impossible, but here they were, still alive, still fighting. Ben couldn't help but smile. The storm had almost broken him, but it had also forged something stronger between him and the cub. They were both survivors, bound by a shared experience that no one else would ever truly understand. And that bond was something that would carry them through whatever lay ahead. He walked for hours, the landscape stretching endlessly before him, the cold air biting at his skin. But as he trudged on, he saw something in the distance, something that made his heart race. It was a small outpost, a research station, barely visible through the haze of the storm's aftermath. Ben's heart surged with hope as he hurried toward it, his legs trembling with exhaustion but pushing forward nonetheless. He had no idea what he would find there, but it was their best shot at survival. When he finally reached the station, he collapsed in front of the door, his body too weak to take another step. He pounded weakly on the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Seconds later, the door swung open, and a figure emerged from inside, a researcher who had been monitoring the storm. "Holy, what is that?" the researcher gasped, his eyes widening at the sight of Ben and the cub. "We need help," Ben managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Please, she needs food, warmth, anything." The researcher's expression softened as he took in the scene, realizing the gravity of the situation. Without hesitation, he pulled them inside, and the warmth of the building enveloped them both. Ben's heart lifted as the door closed behind them, the storm's fury finally silenced by the walls of the research station. They had made it. Against all odds, they had survived. The cub, still weak but alive, was gently placed on a cot, and the researchers immediately began to care for her, offering her the warmth and nourishment she so desperately needed. Ben sat beside her, his eyes never leaving her small, trembling form. As he looked down at the cub, he realized something incredible. In this unforgiving, frozen world, he had found not just a survivor, but a companion, a bond that had saved them both. And as the storm outside faded into the past, Ben knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. Please subscribe, share this story, and leave your thoughts in the comments. The wild is full of miracles, and stories like these remind us of the power of survival and the bonds that unite us all.